Hi, so I wanted to go over the poem that was given for the exam, and I didn't have time in class to give a real complete analysis of it. I did go over the finer points of what the overall meaning was and how I graded the exams. However, I wanted to give you a full analysis on the poem for those of you that were curious. The poem was When I Heard the Learned Astronomer by Walt Whitman. I'll read it one more time through before I begin. When I heard the learned astronomer. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures, were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I sitting heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon unaccountable I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out I wandered off by myself in the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. So the first thing that you probably saw was that it was one stanza, right? And in stanzas we were studying how to count the lines and what the stanzas are. So I just want to show you here. You see there are 8 entries at the margin. And now some of you may have thought that these indents were other lines, but this was actually just a continuation of the line before it. As we talked about Whitman, how he just ends up stopping his lines whenever he feels like it. So at the margin, you can see these 8 entries at the margin. Those are the 8 lines of the stanza. So the stanza is an 8-line stanza, and we know that that is an octave. So that was one of the first technical aspects that I asked you to identify. In our analysis of poetry, I took you through 3 general ways I want you to look at a poem in order to kind of put all the pieces together. Number 1 being the technical aspects or the poetic elements that we studied. Things like alliteration, stanza length, line length, enjambment, etc. The whole litany of things. Then in the second phase, I want you to pull out the lens more and look at the big picture and try to just see what is happening in the poem, kind of just what physically is happening. Is it an image? Is it a narrative? And then the third is to derive meaning, the overall meaning of the poem, which is kind of akin to theme versus plot, where big picture is the plot of the poem, or things that physically are happening in the poem, and the theme or the meaning is the overarching purpose of what the poem is trying to say. So getting into the technical elements, which is the first thing that we look at, I notice immediately repetition, right? Repetition in the first 4 lines, when I heard, when the proofs, when I was shown, when I sitting heard. So he's giving us repetition, which creates a structure, right? When you have a repetition of things, especially the way he sets it up here, where he repeats the very first 2 words of every line is when I or when the, he's creating this very rigid structure of expectation. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were ranged, when I was shown the charts and diagrams, when I sitting heard the astronomer. So we have this first 4 lines of structure. After that, the repetition disappears, and so does the structure, and a new structure kind of appears with the alliteration. See, there's very little, if no alliteration, or the repetition of similar sounding words, similar sounds, especially initial sounds. And when we studied Reapers, I know you'll remember Reapers was also an octave stanza. It was also divided up pretty symmetrically between 4 lines and 4 lines as far as 2 distinct images. And although we do not have 2 distinct images here, in fact, we don't have a complete narrative because we don't have a beginning, middle, end, but we do have a moment that is narrated. We have action and a turn. So we have this speaker who's identified himself as I, right? So you have a point of view. That's another technical element. Okay. I, the first person speaker, declares himself to be sitting and absorbing all of this information, right? And then in the second half of the stanza, the action turns. And so he says, how soon unaccountable I became tired and sick. So something inside of him is actually churning. And then in the second line, till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself. So now the sitter, the speaker who is sitting, is actually now rising and gliding, and he's wandering off by himself. And this is when the alliteration picks up. Okay, so I've kind of melded technical elements and big picture together here, right? I'm doing this right in front of you as I'm reading the poem, so I'm not doing exactly the way that you guys would do it. And I just want to get through the analysis to kind of show you how I'm thinking through it. He also defines the astronomer as learned, and he defines himself as having wandered off and looked. Those two ideas are also contrasting, right? Because you have first you have the physical sitting structure, this kind of stasis in the first section of the poem where he's absorbing information, and then something turns inside of him and it causes him to physically get up by his own direction, and then he leaves, and then something happens outside, right? He is now in this alliterative, mystical, moist night air, and from time to time he looked up in the perfect silence of the stars, right? So this kind of music happens when he leaves the room. The music that was very not present in the first 4 lines, because as you can see, the first 4 lines, there really is no rhythm. There's a repetition, but that creates a structure, but it doesn't create like a song for us, right? So we have now kind of both things. We have the technical elements, and then we have the big picture elements, right? The verbs of him, when I sitting heard, and then later till rising and gliding out, so it shows his change of action. The first 4 lines kind of represent this conceptual understanding of study, right? Where he is sitting and learning, and he kind of gives us this litany of things. He's seen figures and proofs and charts and diagrams, and these are all very measured things, right? Very technically measured things. Then he says that he was taught to add, divide, and measure. Well, what is he talking about? What is the study of astronomy? The study of astronomy is the study of celestial objects and just essentially the entire physical universe that we understand, right? The things that are in the sky, okay? And I pointed out celestial objects to you on the board the day of the exam are planets and stars. So the astronomer is learned. He's studied, okay? So that means he understands this very well. He understands the study of astronomy. He understands the science and the math of it, obviously, because that's what is being described in the first 4 lines, this very technical aspect of astronomy. And something in the speaker says he feels unaccountable. Unaccountable, what does that mean? He feels like he's not part of it. He feels like it's not for him, or it does not account itself to him. He cannot account himself to it. And so he becomes tired, kind of tedious study, and sick, kind of because this unaccountability, this lack of connection, he feels a little bit sick to himself. So he leaves, and his leaving is a little beautiful, right? It's rising and gliding. And he wanders off. What does it mean to wander? To kind of go aimlessly, right? To just kind of go where you are taken. And he looks up only from time to time. See, he's not going out with the intent of studying astronomy to look up at the stars. He says, from time to time, I looked up at the perfect silence of the stars. And there's like another sensual moment there. And by sensual, again, I mean the 5 senses that are sparked. There is a sound in the first 4 lines of the stanza. When he's sitting, he says, lectured with much applause in the lecture room. That's like a raucous sound, right? Applause. And then in the last line of the last 4 lines, silence. Perfect silence, he even says. The perfect silence at the stars. What is he saying? The stars need no explanation to him. He doesn't need to understand the stars in order to understand the stars. Do you get it? The poem is really about the difference of learning something in a lecture room, like you guys often do, and experiencing it in the real world. So I kind of liken this because I want to kind of create an analogy for you guys. And I was thinking, imagine if we sat in a lecture room and I taught you the mechanics of swimming. And I told you what it was for a human being to have to be buoyant in water and to move through water, to tread water. So you'd have to have your arms like this. You have to kick your legs like this. You may have to switch. This is how you have to get air, right? And I explained very clearly to you the technical mechanics of a human being swimming through water. Now, what if you left my room and you jumped in a lake or the ocean and you began to swim and you felt the water around you and you felt the buoyancy and weightlessness of your body? I mean, those two things cannot really be compared, even though they can obviously be compared. You understand what I'm saying? Like, they're the same thing, the mechanics of swimming and swimming, but they're 2 totally different experiences. And in essence, the person who's taking part in it is no longer a spectator in the study of, right? He was a spectator in astronomy in the first 4 lines, and then he was a beholder of the stars. Then he kind of understood it within himself, right? And again, to kind of mimic that rigid structure of astronomy that he's talking about in the first 4 lines, that's why he begins all those lines with when I, because it creates this structure, this rigidity, this expectation. And then in the last 4 lines, it just disappears because the study is gone. And now we are wandering and we are looking and we are living life, because when we are living life, we are wandering and looking. So the first 4 lines are the kind of the conceptual, the theory, the study of, and then the last 4 lines are our reality, or our practical space of how we inherit the world around us and how we put things through our filter to understand them and to comprehend the universe, essentially, right? Because the bigger meaning here is the whole universe. The whole meaning and the very philosophical, existential question is, what is the purpose of life? What is the meaning? What do I understand? All of these things, right? Nobody got this, but it kind of popped in my head and I had to literally look it up because I'm not a science girl, even though I'm obsessed with how awesome science and math is. It's not where my brain naturally tends to thrive. There are also 8 planets in the solar system. So 8 lines in the stanza. I mean, I don't know if Whitman was doing that specifically, but I think that there's always some kind of like perfect symmetry of meaning when all things come together like that. Okay, so I want you to just keep feeling great about everything that you learned the whole month of March that we studied poetry. You guys just really, it was really amazing to see you guys come from a place of feeling so uncomfortable to even read these poems, and you didn't dare to determine meaning from them in the first week, and then to really see you guys come out and be very bold now in trying to stake your claims of what these poems mean. So please don't lose your appreciation for poetry. We really need it, and as you can see, it so much to glean from it, so much to grow from it, and there's just so much there. So I encourage you to keep studying poetry.